All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Reverend Richard Nordgren, Associate Member of St. John's Lutheran Church in beautiful Greenpoint, Brooklyn, which is the sponsor of this Bible study entitled The Many Faces of God. For a number of weeks now, we have been exploring how the scriptures present God to us, the different faces, if you will, personalities, ways of self-revelation. We started with Genesis, and now we're working our way through the book of the kings of Israel. Tonight we will be looking at the second book of Kings. But before we get into that, I would like to give you just a little recap about the topic that we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks and how that fits in with what we're going to be studying tonight. Way back in the beginning, God picked Israel for no particular reason that we are aware of, but he bestowed that honor on that particular people and had promised them that they would be a mighty nation. He promised them that they would have a place of their own. And he promised them a beneficial relationship in which he would look after them with providential care. Now we have seen in the last couple of weeks the fulfillment of the promised land guarantee. Israel occupied Canaan, not completely and not successfully, but enough that they could claim that they had their little patch of ground that they could call their own. They're still working on that reproductive angle and trying to become more populous than other nations. They hadn't succeeded there yet. God had done a pretty good job throughout the centuries of taking care of them. But with the exodus from Egypt, it was time to revise and revamp the covenant relationship that God had made long ago with Abraham, and be more specific about the requirements and expectations of all parties, and the rewards and benefits and consequences and punishments that would befall either the faithful adherence to the covenant or its violation. The failure of Israel to completely and successfully occupy all of Canaan left it with neighbors that had long memories of the injustices that they had suffered and the ability to do something about it. There was a long history of low-grade wars, border crossings and raids and things of that nature. And from time to time, God had responded to those threats and challenges by calling forth a person that we would call judges, people like Deborah and Gideon and Samson. And there was a bunch of others. By and large, these were temporary appointments to deal with the current situation, and at the end of the crisis, the judges would go back to doing whatever they had been doing before they were called active duty. There were some serious limitations about this practice of recruiting a militia leader in the time of need and crisis. One is that Israel never had a well-prepared army to deal with threats as they arose. The militias that were called forth had very little training, they had very little experience. And in the face of determined aggressors, they would not do very well. Consequently, there was a call from some parts of Israel that they needed a king. They thought a king would provide institutional stability, maintain the unarmed forces, be able to levy taxes and do other things that kings do to maintain the safety and security of the country. Not everyone was really excited about the idea of having a monarchy. and perhaps chief among those who were very reluctant to consider this possibility was God. You know, in one of his more sarcastic moments, God muttered, loud enough for others to hear that, aren't I enough king for Israel? But God reluctantly consented to the institution of a monarchy. And the first choice of a king, Saul, turned out to be a roaring disaster. Saul had a good start. He was very successful as a military commander. He did, some pretty good things in terms of administrator. As time got by, his fears and paranoia got the best of him, with some legitimacy, because there were people who were not really content to let him be king for too much longer. And chief among them was this young lad known as David. David in the Old Testament ranks up there with Moses, and I think the popular appeal of many people who know something about Scripture, he ranks up there with Moses and some of the other well-known figures. In our study of David, we learned that he was charismatic. He was very, very capable military person. He was a ruthless politician. He would have put Richard Daley into a shadow. He was, in other words, very effective. But he had a number of character defects and flaws that would get him into trouble from time to time. But for some reason, God took a liking to David, and sort of, turned a blind eye to some of his misbehaviors. Some of them which were very serious. There was one misbehavior that he could not, ignore, and that was David, lusted after a woman by the name of Bathsheba. Engineered a plot to have Bathsheba's husband killed, took her, as his sexual partner, and she actually became somewhat of an advisor to the king. She certainly was no slouch when it came to be a good political operative herself. One of the things that David had thought after things settled down, and there was peace and security in the region, that he wanted to build a house for God, a temple. God was not really excited or enthusiastic about that. And David was not allowed to take that enterprise on. But he did get a consolation prize. God said to David, not you, but your son, who will succeed you. He will build a house for me. And as a consolation prize to you, David, since you seem to be rather disappointed with my decision not to let you build the temple, I will assure you that the kings and rulers of Israel will be your descendants. I make that commitment to you. Perhaps no one took a good, solid look at that covenant promise. But it had the effect of painting God into a corner when the kings of Israel, people such as David and his son Solomon, got into murky waters morally. And the covenant requirement that recalled that if idolatry was permitted, those who permitted it would have to die. Well, God had promised David that his heirs would, be in control of the country. You can't very well, go, murdering or killing off the heirs apparent or the heirs possible, just so that you can keep faith with an earlier agreement. So God had to get creative, and what he did, rather than following the literal requirements of the covenant, he did interpretive and figurative interpretations And so the punishment would not necessarily fall upon the person who was guilty, but on someone who would have meaning and significance to the actual guilty party. So in this case, David and Bathsheba, it wasn't David that suffered. It wasn't Bathsheba that suffered. It was their child who died. Ethically murky course to take, but when God gets boxed into a corner of his own making, the creativity of God shown forth. After the death of David, he was succeeded by his son Solomon, and Solomon was, in many ways, a little bit better than his father, but toward the latter years of his reign, he began to behave more and more the way kings are traditionally, instructed to behave. Kings do what kings do, and that's usually looking after their own interests and the security of their nation. And one of the ways to ensure the security of your nation is to form alliances with more powerful neighbors. So Solomon, married foreign princesses, one from Egypt, one from Moab, one from Aram, probably a whole lot of others. The problem was that these marriages were prohibited by the covenant law. Solomon didn't suffer because of this, and that was not the chief offense that he was guilty of. Toward the end of his life, his foreign-born princesses began to be more insistent that they would have the right to worship their deities in their new home. And as it turned out, some of them were quite persuasive. And we find that Solomon wound up being an idolater. Yeah. Well, that was the sort of transgression that God could not ignore, just could not ignore it. And so he had to do something about that. And he could not, withhold or withdraw his support of Solomon, but he had to chasten him in a very significant and noteworthy way. So he went to a fellow who was part of the royal court by the name of Jeroboam and said to him, you have found favor with me. When Solomon dies, you are going to gain control of the 10 northern tribes, and you will rule them. In honor of my agreement with David, his son Solomon, and his heirs will retain the 2 southern tribes, Ephraim and Judah, and their reign will be limited to that. And that's indeed what happened when Solomon died. His son, who was succeeding him, Rehoboam, found that he had an insurrection on his hands. The 10 northern tribes, revolted and broke off, Jeroboam, was made the king of those northern tribes. I'm going to say a couple of things about nomenclature at this point. Up to this point, the nation and the political unit that we've been dealing with have both been named Israel. The 10 northern tribes, retained that name, and the 2 southern tribes went by the name of the dominant one, which was Judah. But in terms of culture and religion, they had many things in common. And so when I'm talking about Israel and Judah as a people that had a covenant relationship with God, I will call them Israel rather than their political names. I hope this doesn't get too confusing, but the nomenclature is what it is, and that we can't do anything about. So after the separation of Israel into two nations, each of them had their own rule. They had their they developed separate religious practices, and the northern kingdom fell in disfavor from God. I said that kings tend to do what kings tend to do. And perhaps the best example of that is what King Ahab did when he came to into power in the northern kingdom. He had a wife who was very influential over him, who persuaded him to allow her to worship her deity, and that he granted her. And this is one of those unforgivables as far as God is concerned. God was coming to the recognition that the kings of Israel could not be trusted to act as royal viceroys. They saw themselves as rulers rather than representatives of God. And Ahab certainly saw himself as a ruler of his own people, of his own nation, and that he did not see himself as beholden to God, in terms of loyalty and fealty. He did not see himself as obligated to God to maintain behavioral standards. He did not see himself as the person who was going to police the covenant. Since God found that most of the kings of Israel and Judah were not trustworthy in those areas, God turned to a new form of viceroy or representative, people we know as prophets. Now, there had been prophets in Israel before this time. We remember Samuel and Nathan as two men of integrity who had the character and the ability to speak truth to power, whether that be Saul or David or Solomon. But by and large, the prophets that were associated with the royal courts knew the hand that fed them and delivered sweet and comforting messages to their paymasters. God needed an independent person who was not beholden to the court for his daily bread. And one such person that is very important in the Old Testament is a prophet that God called to speak to Ahab, and his name was Elijah. Now, Elijah was an important figure, in the downfall of Ahab and of his wife Jezebel. He was succeeded by another well-known prophet, Elisha, and both of them demonstrated that strength of character, the integrity and independence that allowed them to be faithful witnesses to God and the courts of Israel and Judah. The combination of God's decision to use prophets as divine ambassadors rather than the kings, and the use of foreign nations to affect his will became an important part of how God dealt with the kings of Judah and Israel in this time. One of the things that you may have noticed is that after the Exodus and the invasion of Canaan, God became less and less involved in direct and personal intervention. God was more likely to use natural forces, the environment, or the political and military designs of foreign nations. And as God said to David about how he would treat his successors, he would chasten them as a father would guide and chasten a son, using foreign nations as rods of iron to punish misbehavior. The practice of using foreign powers to get a message across that the boundary had been crossed was not a perfect system. Perhaps it was better than the failure of the kings to do what they were doing. But probably the most effective way of getting God's messages across was the use of these independent prophets. And we can ask the question, why God chose not to have his hand on the steering wheel on every occasion, particularly when idolatry is at stake. But we do see in 2 Kings the use of foreign powers and of prophets rather than direct intervention. Let me stop here and we'll turn to reading some of the passages from Scripture which illustrate, what I've been talking about. And Megan, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Could you read from 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 5 through 41?
All right. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the ninth year of Hoshea, the king of Syria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Hawa on the Haber, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of Medes. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets." They would not listen, but were stubborn as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their ancestors and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do as they did. They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast images of 2 calves. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and their daughters pass through fire. They used divination and archery. I don't know. And they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel continued in all the sins that Jeroboam committed. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had foretold through all his servants, the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, close, and placed them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. They took possessions of Samaria and settled in its cities. When they first settled there, they did not worship the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, "The nations that you've carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore, he has sent lions among them. They are killing them because they do not know the law of the God of the land." Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there. Let him go and live there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel. He taught them how they should worship the Lord. But every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the people of Samaria had made, every nation in the cities in which they lived. The people of Babylon made Succoth Benoth. The people of Cuth made Nergal. The people of Hamath made Ashima. The Avites made Nebas and Tartak. The Severites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech, and Amalek, the gods of Zepharim. They also worshiped the Lord and appointed him from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they worshiped the Lord, but also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. To this day, they continue to practice their former customs. They do not worship the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the ordinances or the law or the commandment that the Lord had commanded the children of Jacob, who he named Israel. The Lord had made a covenant with them and commanded them, "You shall not worship other gods or bow yourselves to them or serve them or sacrifice to them, but you shall worship the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm. You shall bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. The statutes and ordinances and the law and the commandment that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to observe. You shall not worship other gods. You shall not forget the covenant that I have made with you. You shall not worship other gods, but you shall worship the Lord your God. He will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies." They would not listen, however, but they continued to practice their former custom. So these nations worship the Lord, but also serve their carved images. To this day, their children and their children's children continue to do as their ancestors did.
Thank you. Boy,
Good
you had a
job, Megan.
That's a long one.
Yeah.
Augury, by the way, is the work of an augur, the interpretation of omens.
Yes.
So they try to figure out what's going to happen in the future.
The Romans had auguries, and they would sacrifice birds and look at the intestines and see what that told them. Some people look at tea leaves and do the same thing. Right. Thank you, Megan, for tongue twisting your way through a long and complicated passage. There's a number of things which I think are noteworthy in what you just read. One is that this is a lengthy bill of indictment. The sins and transgressions of the northern kingdom and its people were laid out in great detail. The chief offense, in fact, just about the only one that has any detail attached to it, is the offense of idolatry, of being unfaithful, to the Lord. This was the cause that provoked the workings of the political system such that the northern kingdom essentially went out of existence. It is also called Samaria, by the way, further adding to our confusion about naming. This is a time when God did have his hands on the steering wheel. And he had a remarkably effective instrument, to use to punish the lack of fidelity and loyalty that was summed up in the Bill of Indictment. For much of Israel's history, it had been fortunate that the regional powers were either at some low point or were preoccupied with other contenders or had other things that they needed to take care of. The result of which is that for many, many years, Israel was not bothered by its more powerful neighbors in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Now, Israel had the misfortune of being in a rather vulnerable geographical location. Big powers, the Fertile Crescent, were Egypt and whoever happened to be in control of Mesopotamia, what we now know as Iraq and parts of Syria. And when those two regional powers, Egypt and Mesopotamia, had issues with one another, the way to get at each other was to march through the place where the Israelites were. For a long time, Israel had not been really seriously bothered by these two powers for the reasons that I already have mentioned. But that changed with the rise of the Assyrian Empire. It was located at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's northern Syria, the eastern part of Turkey, and northern parts of Iraq. They were a very effective political and military force, and they gained increasingly larger and larger control over the region. They had a policy of building great and wonderful monuments. And they had a policy that favored the completion of the first one was to conscript labor from recently conquered territories to build these wonderful monuments. And so when Assyria wiped out the northern tribes, it took the vast majority of the population captive and sent them off to work in labor camps, the gulags of the era. And for all intents and purposes, the 10 northern tribes, go out of the history of the rest of the reigning tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Those who took the place of the deported Israelites had their own ways and fashions and religions and ways of doing things. They were influenced to some extent by the remnant that was left behind in the northern tribe area and by the influence of the southern kingdom. But the sum and substance of it all is that the the northern tribes, have disappeared from the history. Okay? Assyria was not satisfied, by its conquest of the northern kingdom. If it was going to get to Egypt, which was its grand strategy, it was going to have to march through the southern kingdom. And not long after they had swallowed and digested the northern kingdom, they set their sights on Jerusalem and Judah. They besieged Jerusalem, but it was Israel's good fortune at that time that they had a king who was a head and shoulders above his predecessors and successors, someone who took the covenant of the Lord seriously, and who God was going to favor. So God sent an angel, and a plague was inflicted upon the besieging Assyrian army, and Judah was spared. But the intervention on part of God to spare Judah the fate of the northern kingdom was a short-lived reprieve. The kingdom of Assyria did not last long on the regional horizon. It was replaced by the Babylonians, who in the year 587 conquered much of the region and deported the elites and significant part of the population from Judah into Babylon. The exile, as this deportation was called, was probably the most traumatic cultural, personal, and theological event in the memory of people. It called into question all sorts of assumptions and things taken for granted. It called into to being questions about the very nature of the relationship with God, between God and Israel, and how the Sinai covenant was going to be understood and used when so much death and destruction had been carried out against God's people.
Pastor Nordgren?
Yes.
I was struck by a couple of things. The sin of worshiping God, but also like having a side chick God.
Yeah.
When Megan was reading that is such an American point of view.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, we're going to worship God, but we're also going to, hedge our bets.
Right.
And, and we'll be Buddhist and Lutheran and hang out over here. I mean, we are like a buffet, and so it's very interesting as an Orthodox Christian. I wasn't raised in the Orthodox tradition, but I am a very Orthodox Christian, to say something like Jesus is the Messiah, that people get offended by that. And it's like, they're like, well, we all talk to the same God. It's like, no, we don't. Actually, not even Christians are talking to the same God. I don't know who y'all are talking to, but that hateful crap that y'all are doing, that's not right. So, but we have this kind of hedging our bets mentality. Like, we're going to do this, but we're also going to do this. And the thing we do it the most with is money, power, and prestige. Like, those are our side chick gods, right? But the other thing, when you were talking about the removal of people and the displacement as a very traumatic experience, if we're still talking about that as a seminal event in the history of the holy people, much closer in our lived history, we did that.
Oh, yeah.
People and, bought them and then came over here, stripped them of their medical practices, culture, religion, language, familial connectivity. And, we did that. And as Americans, we're like, that crap is over. I didn't own slaves. I'm done. It's not my fault. And, we're still talking about what happened to the Jewish people in the Babylonian captivity with no problems. But if you bring up the ongoing lived realities of our Black of various persuasion siblings in this country, it's we don't want to hear it, and North Koreans have stolen South Koreans. The Japanese turned Korean women into comfort slaves or something like that, stripped them. And it's like, this is all some of this is within our lifetime and happening right now. And we're all like, we don't want to hear about it. Let's talk about the Babylonian captivity that happened, 3,000 years ago? We're good with that, but not now. Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting to me how stuff, it applies now. And I would say that what we're seeing in Israel too is, taking people away from their land, from their olive trees, from culture, from language, from familial connectivity. And that, we keep displacing people. And as we displace people, we should not be surprised that there's generational traumatic responses to these things.
Yeah.
I just, I preached about Israel this morning, and I'm, and they're just going for it tonight over there. It's crazy. So anyway.
There's another example which comes to mind about the displacement of people, and that's what we have done with the Native Americans in this country.
Yes.
We have done a world-class ethnic cleansing.
Mm-hmm. We tried.
Yeah, we practically wiped out 90% of the original inhabitants.
Yeah.
And then the remnants, who are left, who want to express, their independence by putting up a small casino on the Shinnecock Reservation out by the Hamptons.
We lived out there. We got to know some of the folks from the Shinnecock tribe, and they put up that big advertisement pole, basically.
So funny.
And the John Oliver, one of them, did a whole segment on it, and the white people were so aggrieved, and the Shinnecock were like, "Yeah, this is our land. We're gonna make money. Screw you. You stole everything. Get over yourselves." It's crazy.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something when you were talking about the angel.
Yes.
So, because the thing is, the angel comes, but it's not good. It's really,
they're not necessarily soft, white, fuzzy, sweet individuals.
No, that's not what we think of when we think of angels either, right? It's sort of so violent, and God, it just seems, I think that's kind of this very scary thing about God being like this.
Oh yeah.
This really vindictive.
Yeah. As we get into the story of the kings, we find that God has less and less direct involvement. It's certainly not at the level of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. But when you're dangling on the point of an Assyrian sword, that God is using as a rod of iron to chasten his people, it really doesn't matter much, whether God's hand is directly on the steering wheel or the pummel of the sword or not. It just doesn't make a whole lot of difference. God's decision to use foreign nations for his purposes brings up some really important questions. God has an exclusive relationship with his holy people that he called, from the descendants of Abraham. But when he chooses to use foreign nations, he's also entering into a relationship with them. Now, it's not a covenantal relationship. It's truly more of an instrumental relationship. but it has the effect, of increasing the circle of God's concern, concern for Assyria, Babylon, and a host of lesser nations, which now, become part of the calculus that God has to solve. These events, present, a further difficulty. God had, ignored some of the misbehavior of the kings, and sometimes not. Sometimes, a reprieve was granted, and sometimes not. But the problem with God's mercy, is that the covenant is a consequences-based document, a relationship based on behavior. It is, spelled out in exquisite detail. If you do this, that's going to happen. If you don't do that, this is what's going to happen. It's very clear that it's transactional. In the covenant, particularly you find in Deuteronomy 30, some escape clauses. There's the possibility of pardon and a relief from the required punishments. Another loophole that we have examined is the figurative rather than the literal interpretation of the law. The imaginative and creative understanding of consequences that work its way around the strict requirements. When we have a consequence-based relationship, there are certain questions that are asked, on the part of those who have suffered from the sins of the kings of Israel. Can God be trusted and relied upon to take their side when the kings misbehave? Or are they going to get a pass and I will see no justice? If there is going to be extensive use of loopholes and figurative interpretations, what is the purpose of having consequences in the first place? If the precedent is established, then does that not make God either come across as some easy touch, or a paper tiger, or a whimsical enforcer of the covenant? Problem with the covenant is that it is consequence-based, and if you have provisions, to get around those consequences, there are important questions that have to be asked. And these are the questions which are being asked by the Israelites during their captivity in Babylon. Next week, we'll be getting into the prophet Isaiah. The first segment of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, cover period before the Babylonian exile. But there are certainly events looming on the horizon, which give thought, to the people who are considering such things, people like Isaiah. These are things which are going to have important consequences, if they come in the form that God has told me to tell Israel about. So look forward to some really interesting struggles, in the next couple of weeks as we look at how the prophets, give their message, what their message is, and how that is responded to by the Judeans in exile. So with that, I'm going to close off and ask if anyone would like to have a final word or ask a question or start a discussion of some sort. No? Okay.
I would just remind us, you're probably going to do this, Pastor, that Isaiah was not written by one person, but was written over the course of about 100 years, at least, by 3 different schools of prophets, essentially. I think it's one of the most beautiful books in all of Scripture. It really
there's scholarly debate as to whether there's 2 or 3 distinct Isaiahs there. It used to be thought that there were 3, but there's a scholarly opinion now that says there's just 2.
Really? Because I would argue for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah.
Yeah.
Right, so me and you may throw down next week.
No, I'm on your side. No, I think
I'm open to the possibilities. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I haven't studied the folks who are in favor of a 2-author book, but I know of it. Just I don't know enough of it to do it. And so I wasn't going to pursue that one because it's not germane to our intents for this class.
Well, and it's one of the books that is probably better known in part because of Handel's Messiah.
Yeah.
So much of that is taken from Isaiah, that it has made it into kind of common culture in a way.
Yeah.
That I think is very interesting.
Well, Handel's Messiah is a summary of Reformed theology.
What do you mean?
Yeah. Well, he uses the scriptures, to outline the essential points of Reformed theology.
Huh. I've never heard that before.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Lutherans have Bach, and that kind of trumps everything.
Yeah. Bach does the same thing. Bach wanted to be a theologian, but he was talented as a musician. Yeah.
Well, he put it all together. So.
Yeah, he was good. Both of them were excellent musicians. Too.
Yes.
Okay.
Jess, you didn't say anything today.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Next week.
All right.
All right. Well, if I leave you things to ponder upon for a week, that's good.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to sign off, friends. Remember that these classes are streamed on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. So if you want to tell people to follow them up, at a time of more convenience to them, there's those venues that they can do it. Like I said, next week we'll be looking at Isaiah, the first 39 chapters. There's a lot of it you can skim over because they're oracles against foreign nations that I'm not going to delve into. So it will be a faster read than it may seem. So with that, I'll close us with prayer. Gracious and loving God, once again we have seen you in Scripture as a comforter, but also as someone who gives us warnings and notices, who is not willing to allow us to sink into our own folly and evilness without being told that it's something that we should avoid. We thank you for your kindness that prevents us from getting stuck in our own evilness, our own proclivity to sin. So for that and for the many blessings which you have bestowed upon us this day, this week, and in our lives, we give you thanks in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. See you later, guys.